These are the studies I use when I study with non-Christians, with somebody who's trying to find out more about God and knows nothing or knows a little bit. I want to make sure that they're seeing what God says about himself. And so there's no better place to do that than looking at what he's revealed about himself here. Most of you know that I came to God as an atheist and was trying to prove he didn't exist by using his word to prove that. And the more I read it, the more I realized, wait a second, I've got a problem. He does exist, and he's showing himself here. He's manifested himself here in a very special way, but he's manifested himself in his creation in a way that makes it very unrighteous of me to deny that he exists. We looked at that in Romans 1 last night, that God is rightfully wrathful toward men for denying his existence when they can see what he's made. So we're going to look today at what he says about what he's made. I believe that when Paul says in Romans 1, we can know his eternal Godhead, his eternal existence in Godhead by the things that were made. I think what he's saying is basically something similar to what was said in Hebrews 11, that by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. And so as God tells us how he made the worlds, the heavens and the earth, as God tells us how he made those, he's revealing himself to us. We see him in this revelation. So I want to share that with you. I'm foregoing the slides today because they are very information heavy. I'm afraid I'll be distracted by them. I want you to have them, so I'm going to make them available. Miss Arlene, I will use them tomorrow because I know the kids will be taking notes from them, and you've set that up, and I thank you so much for that. But today's lessons, I want to just kind of walk you through an overview of how I would do this if I were just sitting across the table from you and we were studying these texts together. Because it's the text that needs to carry the message. And so let's look at Genesis 1. We're going to do a lot of reading of the text. Verses 1 through 5. I want to point you to some things in this text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. It says here that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So if in the beginning God created, what was there before the beginning? It's a simple question. What was there before the beginning? Feel free to answer that if you'd like to. What was there before that? Thank you. God is the right answer. A lot of times they get, there was nothing. There was nothing there at all. But there was God. I believe this very first verse of the Bible is showing us God's eternal nature. The Creator has to exist before the creation can exist. And so he was there before the creation. I don't know what all that entails, but I know that he was there. There's a difference in being eternal and being immortal. God makes some things that are immortal. Our souls are immortal. We die physically, but our soul continues on. But God is greater than that. He's eternal. He had no beginning and no end. He was there for everything that we know of as a beginning. He was already there. He is eternal. He will always have existed, always does exist, and always will exist. So he can say, I am, I am. He's always present, I am. But we see that, I think, implied already in the very first verse of the Bible, God's eternal nature, because the Creator must exist before the creation. I want to show you an interesting parallel. Go to John chapter 1 with me. We looked last night at Romans chapter 1 that says if we can see a creation, then we must know there's a Creator. That's the argument from design. And that is the strongest argument of evidence for the existence of God, is that there's a creation, so there must have been a creator. But it's the argument that John himself, the apostle, uses in John chapter 1 for Jesus. Let's read the first 3 verses here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. When we get down to verse 14, this Word becomes flesh. We know him as Jesus. But what John is saying is, if he was in the beginning and he made all things, he is God. He's eternal. And that is exactly the point that John is going to be making through his gospel, is that Jesus is divine. He's eternal God in flesh. So he goes back to Genesis chapter 1 to make his argument. He starts it the exact same way in John chapter 1. So going back to Genesis now, God was there before the beginning. He created the heavens and the earth. That is the way of saying the universe, everything that exists. We may look at that and think we're talking of celestial things and physical things, or maybe spiritual things and physical things. And I think that'd be exactly right. That is what we're seeing. God is the maker of all things, even the spiritual things, the things that don't have a body. the things that are the reality, perhaps, behind the physical things that we see. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this. But I want to call your attention to verse 2. There are three situations that we're told about in verse 2. The earth is without form. The earth is in chaos. The earth is a mess in this first verse. It is also void. Some of your versions may have the word empty there. That's what void means. And there's darkness on the face of the deep. And some of the translations have this sort of abyss of darkness. This deep darkness is this idea. So there is formlessness, there is emptiness, and there is this deep darkness. As we go through chapter 1 of Genesis, we're going to watch God deal with all three of those situations. I don't think what we're seeing is that God started to make something and, oh no, he made a mess of it. That's not the point. God is allowing us to watch his process. And so he starts with this, and he's going to show how he's the one who fixes emptiness and darkness and formlessness and chaos. He's the one who fixes all of that. He's going to let us observe how he does that. He is telling us this revelation of how he made things, so we'll learn something about him. And that's what he's going to let us observe. But there's something else in verse 2 that I think is one of the most important points that we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 1. The first time we meet God in the Bible, the first time he presents himself to us in the Bible, how does he present himself? What do you see in verse 2? He's spirit. The very first time we meet God, we don't meet him as Jesus, as a man. We meet him as spirit. The Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the water. Do you know why? I think this is where most people jump ship when it comes to serving God. Because what happens is people try to create God in the image of a man because they're thinking maybe even of Jesus, but they begin to think that God is like a man. So he thinks like we do. He feels like we do. He figures things out the way we do, and we forget that he is spirit. The only way we can know what is in the mind of spirit is if spirit reveals that to us. Paul makes that argument in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. I can't know the things that are in the mind of a man unless he reveals it, so much more with the Spirit of God, but he has revealed it to us. So I can't just guess and figure out what God wants. Since he is spirit, it means I have to wait until he tells me what he wants. He has to reveal it in some way. And God is doing that here. But the first time we meet him as spirit. Think about that in other places in the Bible. When Moses met God for the first time, what was that like? Some of you younger folk might recognize that story. We're all going to think about that. And most people that you're studying with have heard of that story at least. How did Moses meet God the first time? What was God like? What do you remember happened? I heard on the questions on the review on Wednesday. How did Moses first encounter God? Somebody can say it. A burning bush. Was the bush actually burning though? And no, that was what was strange about it. It looked like it was burning, but Moses went to investigate because that fire's not consuming that plant. And so he goes and looks, and as he nears, from this fire comes a voice. It tells Moses, don't come any closer, take your sandal off, this is holy ground, and begins to say, I am the God of your fathers. I am this eternal existence. But he appeared in the form of a flame, perhaps. But if Moses had reached out and touched that flame, he couldn't hold it in his hand. There's nothing physical to it. It wasn't physically burning the plant. It was just an image of this power that God is. That's what that flame was really representing. And so Moses meets God first on sort of spiritual terms. Think about when Israel first met God then. As Moses is bringing Israel out of Egypt, how does God appear to them? I heard it. Pillar of cloud and fire. So again, you grab a cloud. You got in your hand. There's nothing there. There's a manifestation, something you can see. You can tell it's there. You can see its effects, but you can't grab it. It's not physical. So God used some way to express his spirit nature before them. Why is that important? In Deuteronomy chapter 4, when Moses is lining out the law for these people who spent 40 years in the wilderness, he says, I want you to remember, starting at verse 15, that you saw no form when God appeared to you on the mountain, so that you would not be tempted to make an image of God that looked like birds or four-footed animals or man or sun and moon and stars, that you wouldn't be tempted to worship any of that stuff, but you would know it's the Lord your God who brought you out of the furnace of Egypt. Nothing physical about him. He is spirit. So Moses is preparing the people to go into this promised land and to worship God, and he says you must recognize that God is spirit and not like anything else that he's made. And then in John chapter 4, Jesus meets this Samaritan woman at the well. And she says, I can tell you're a prophet. He's told her things about her life that no one else could know. And she says, you must be a prophet. Tell me something. Where is the right place to worship? Is it here on this mountain, as our fathers say, or in Jerusalem? And he says, neither of those. He says the time is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. And then he says, God is spirit. And the true worshipers must worship God in spirit and truth. Did you notice what happened at the beginning of both covenants? This distinction that God is not a man. Don't try to worship him like a man. Don't think, I'll just pray a couple more minutes and then he'll be satisfied. Or I'll just give a little bit more money and that'll do it. No. I've got to know what is it that he wants. I've got to wait till he tells me and respond to that. That's what he's looking for. The heart of obedience, not just the stuff, but the giver of the stuff. That's what he's looking for. Because as a spirit, he wants a relationship. And so in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, it's imperative that we understand right away that we're not dealing with some idol god, with some man god. We're dealing with spirit. And both Moses and Jesus thought that was imperative to be able to worship God properly, and I believe it's imperative also. The Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters there in verse 2 of Genesis 1. In verse 3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Sometimes I'm sitting at a table with somebody, I say, you do that. I reach over and turn on a light switch or something. I say, nope, that's not what God did. You've just manipulated some electricity. Make light. Science is debating all the time, what is light? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Does it have any kind of substance? E equals mc squared, eventually it becomes massive. But what is it? I can walk through a beam of light, it doesn't affect me. So what is light? I don't know. God made that by saying, hey, light exists. And it did. What does that show us about God? What do you see in that? I mean, it's such a small verse. But what do we see that God has just done? What was the word you might use? I saw somebody mouth. What's that? Omnipotent, which has the word power, all power. And that's it. The power that God has, that he makes a command and things just respond. He has the power in his word to make light exist. We're going to see that over and over down through this text. He just speaks and the thing just is. I can't do that. I can't even do that and get my kids to do what I've said all the time. Sometimes they do. But I don't have that kind of power, but God does. He just speaks and it happens. And that is the same power that he has, not only to create the world, but to recreate in us what we are meant to be once we've messed it up. That's really where this is going. And if we truly believe that he has that power with his word, we will not be tempted to change it, to add to it or take away from it. We'll say, if you said so, Lord, then this is it. I think about Peter on the boat in Luke chapter 5, and they fished all night, and Jesus, this carpenter, says, throw your nets on the other side. And at first he protests, we've been fishing all night and have caught nothing. Then he says, but at your word, I'll throw the net in, and woo, look at all the fish they brought in. At his word, things are different. We've got to trust that. We can look with all of our human reasoning and all of the things. We'll see that in chapter 3. That's what he does. All the human reasoning that says, no, this is what's got to be. But if God says it's this every time. That's the power of his word. And we see it in verse 3 already, and we'll see it all through this text. So God spoke, and there was light. In verse 4, this is really the title of our lesson, God saw the light that it was good. God is going to declare things good 7 times in this week of creation. It's kind of fascinating to see that. We're going to see 7 a lot, besides just 7 days. There's going to be 7 times God will do a lot of stuff. But he says it is good. And he'll look at another time and say it is good, and it is good, and it is good. And finally he'll say, indeed, it is very good. 7 times. We ought to be impressed by that. What that shows us is that God, when he does things, they're good. It's his nature to do good things. How many of you here do good things? I think all of us would say we're trying to do good things. How many of you have ever gone to bed and said, everything I did today was good? I don't think there's been a day in my life where I haven't laid down and thought, I should have done that different. That wasn't good. God never has a day like that. Everything he does is good because his nature will not let him do anything that is not good. Now, when I was an atheist coming to the Bible, there were things I didn't like in the Bible. There were things I saw, I thought, what kind of God would say that? What kind of God would do that? And I struggled with that. But the more I saw, the more he proved that he is good, it began to change my perspective. If there's something I find in the Bible that I think is not good. It's me who needs to change because God has done good, and it's all he can do. The brokenness makes us look at things differently. That's like we talked about looking at life through a broken lens because we are broken and this world is broken. And if we try to fix it with brokenness, it's going to be more broken. We've got to see clearly as God points things out, God is good. And he will clarify our vision on what goodness is if we'll listen to him. If we listen to the world, goodness is going to be very skewed and very broken. If we listen to God, goodness takes on new perspective. And we begin to realize, whoa, actually, that was a good thing. What God does is always good. God then divides, or some of your versions may have the word separated, the light from the darkness. That is something else we're going to see God do 7 times in this text. It's going to separate light and darkness. It's going to separate waters above and below, waters side to side. It's going to separate the animals into distinct species. It's going to separate the sun and the moon and the stars. It's going to make all these separations. The root behind that idea is holiness. God is separate from the creation as he is the creator, and he separates things into their respectful purposes and uses. And that concept is holiness. You know you're going to get a lesson on holiness in Genesis chapter 1, but that's what you're getting. They're object lessons on holiness. When you go through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you see why in the world these crazy laws about only wearing one type of clothing. Those are images, those are object lessons of holiness. You don't teach calculus to a 4th grader. You teach apples and oranges to a kindergartner, then you've got number concepts by the time you get to 3rd and 4th grade, and you get a little more deep. When you get to high school, once these object lessons have been used, you can then teach deeper things. God is teaching the Israelites through object lessons about holiness, keeping things separate, and these plants in that field, and these plants in this field, these animals here, this clothing of this type. So by the time you get to the New Testament, that tutor has brought us to Christ, where we can understand the deeper concept of holiness. Be separate from them, come out from among them and be holy, that kind of idea. But it starts here, as the holy God is separating things into their rightful places and proportions. God saw that it was good and separated light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. God is the God who creates all things and names things according to their purpose. He's going to call things or name things 7 times in this first chapter. As we go through this, he's naming and separating and creating good 7 times over. He'll do that. God is an amazing God. He calls the light day and the darkness he calls night. So evening and morning are the first day. We've learned an awful lot about God in 5 verses. This is usually my first study with somebody. It takes about an hour sitting across the table as we go through these texts. And sometimes I'll show them the parallel text that I get these other ideas from. I'm going a little quicker with you. If you would like to study this later with me personally, I will Zoom call with you. We can go through these things a little more plausibly. We don't have the time to do that today. I want to make sure we get the basis of these things down. You see how much you've learned in 5 verses about the nature of God? In 5 verses, there's a whole bunch more we're going to go through still. I think this is amazing, and it excites me very much to be able to share this with people because I hope you're seeing the greatness of God in the way he's revealed himself in creation. Let's look at the second day and the third now, verses 6 through 13. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. God speaks again. This time he says, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters." Such a strange word, this New King James language. But he's made this expanse or this firmament that's going to divide lower waters from upper waters. So we begin to notice there is oceans or seas, as he'll call them in a moment. He doesn't call them clouds, but that's the idea of these upper waters. There's this upper layer of water. He's got a purpose for that that'll be found out later in about Genesis 6 through 9, when these upper waters end up flooding the earth and these lower waters come up, God's reserving that particular world under judgment, Peter says later, underwater for judgment. He's put that up there. There's a later purpose for it. But there is this water cycle that's been created. Now you have light and water, and you have a water cycle, and all of a sudden you have a breathable atmosphere. This is science, people. God is making all of this that will sustain life as we know it in a physical form here on the earth. God's providing a place for life. And so he separated these waters. He's holified or sanctified these waters from each other. Then he brings up dry land and separates waters sideways from that. So there's now a place, a physical place, to be able to put living beings in plants. In fact, that's the next thing we see. This word, though, firmament, verse 8, is what God names this expanse. He calls it heaven. And so that word heaven is really the word that describes the sky. The Hebrew word for heaven, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this happens in Hebrew and in Greek. It also happens in Portuguese, so that's how I understood it better. There's really only one word for heaven, or for the heavens, which is outer space, or for the heaven of heavens, which is the celestial realm, if you will. It's where God resides. It's sort of a spiritual place. So you'll have to look at context to see what's being talked about. But this heaven here is the blue sky. This is our atmosphere. This is where birds fly. This is where we can look out and see things. And later on, we'll see the heavens mentioned when we see the sun, moon, and stars. We see them in the heaven, but they're actually out in the heavens. And so we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit when we get there. But God has named this place heaven or sky. And some of your versions may have that. So God has made this, he's divided this, he's prepared this place, and now that he's got this land, and he's gathered the water together in seas, and the dry land appears. This is the way he likes it. He saw that it was good. In verse 11, he says, let the earth bring forth grass. And he sets up a natural law for the propagation of these plant species. And that law is, they will come up and they will have seed within themselves. They will bear fruit that has seed for the next generation. That is a law that is so fixed that by the time we get to the New Testament, thousands of years later, Jesus can make a parable about the scattering of seed and that it will produce according to that seed that's been scattered. Depending on how the soil responds to it, it should produce. But it's always going to produce whatever was planted. That's what God's looking for, the kind of soil that will be rich enough to produce fruit, the seed that's been planted. You can use that as a natural law. It's going to be continuous through the generations. So the evening and morning were the third day. I want you to notice something about what God's doing, though. As he has, with his first declaration, taken care of the problem of darkness, he created light into that darkness. He has also now taken care of the formlessness. He has organized this earth into land and seas and sky. The things that we would recognize as being the order of things here on our planet. In fact, it's what they're looking for on other planets, so they can say life can probably happen there, but they don't have those things yet. It happens here, where God has organized that disorder that we saw before. I want to think about that for a moment, and in a moment we'll see the third thing, the emptiness being fulfilled. But I want to think about this concept of God ordering things. When you think about God's word, what's another word you might use for the words of God? You think about maybe the book of Exodus. What's a word that comes out? You think about God's words in the book of Exodus. Laws, maybe. I'm thinking of a different word. Think about Exodus 20, with the 10 commandments. They're commands. They're commands or they're laws. Or if you're thinking in military fashion, what kind of command does the higher up give to his? He gives orders. Isn't that what God's word is doing? It's ordering his creation. So I want to think about something with you for a second. That's a struggle for me as an atheist. And it's a struggle for some people that come to us when we're studying the Bible. God is all-powerful. We saw he's omnipotent, right? He speaks and it happens. He's all-powerful. We say he's all-loving. He's a God who orders his creation by his word. I firmly believe that he does that. So why, when I look out my window, do I see a person laying on the street, passed out drunk, or having used drugs? Why do I see someone getting shot by someone who was angry? Why do I see all of the decay, especially in the fall, the winter? Why do I see things that are clearly disordered? If God's word is a God of order, why is there not order in this universe? I want to think about that for a second. Think about military commands. Got a whole row of soldiers here. And the guy who's giving the command says march, and they begin to march forward. And he says, march right. And most of them march right. One guy marches left. What happens to that column? Disorder. Was it a problem with the lawgiver? No. Somebody in that column did not obey. They created disorder, because disorder is the result of disobedience to the law given by the one who gives the orders. What would you expect this world to look like with 8 billion people who've decided, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it? God is giving order, and I'm saying, nope, this way. What should the world look like? Much worse than it does. I think God is a God of grace. Because even in the midst of all of the disobedience, creating disorder upon disorder upon disorder, we see a lot of order. We see a lot of his grace covering over the brokenness of people and restoring people even in the midst of the brokenness. But I want you to understand, when we begin to see the brokenness and the disorder, that is not a God problem. It's not that he can't fix that. In fact, that's what he's doing in Christ. He's reordering the creation. I want you to think about that concept when you think about the gospel. Mark 16, I love the way he sends them out in Mark 16. He says, go preach the gospel to all creation. Because, Romans 8, the creation was broken, was subject to futility. The creation needs this restoration. It's the gospel that's going to do it by ordering men back to where they're supposed to be. Genesis 6, the creation had corrupted its way because of men's disorder. It's amazing to think about. That's a theme that goes through the Bible. Disorder is not because God can't maintain order. It's because people don't listen. It's because we've chosen something else. And that brokenness is really our fault. We'll see that clearly in chapter 3. But I wanted to lay that before you. I want you to think about that a bit. The disorder is not because God can't keep order. It's because we won't listen. All right. So 8 billion people not obeying. And yet, I think this world still has a lot of beauty in it compared to what it ought to look like. Let's pick up at verse 14. This is my favorite part of Genesis 1 because I think we begin to see some purpose to God's creation this way in these verses. Verses 14 through 19. Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the 4th day. God spoke again, let there be light, though this time he says it in the plural. Let there be lights in the firmament. And I want you to notice now, the God who has spoken light into darkness and who has organized the chaos is now filling the heavens even with all of this light. Can you imagine what it would be like at night if you looked out and there were no stars? There were no sun or moon during the day. It was just blackness as far as you could see. How frightening that would be. There's actually a description of that in Acts chapter 28 when they're on the ship, and for 14 days they don't see the sun, moon, or stars. And they're all in despair. They despaired of hope of even salvation. They throw all the stuff off the things, all the stuff off the ship. And Paul says, I have a light for you. The God, the living God whom I serve, has spoken with me through his angel and says we're going to be saved. He's got light of God's revelation for them in the midst of that darkness. But I want you to consider, have you ever been somewhere where it's just absolute pitch blackness? I'm from Kentucky where there's this mammoth cave system, and they do tours where they take people down in there and they turn off the lights. And then slowly the guy turns on a pin light. And from what I've heard, I've never been a part of these tours. What I've heard, everybody is gathered around that light. When the electric lights come back on, everybody's around that one little light. You don't recognize how much you need the light until you have to face the darkness. We think about Jesus describing hell. We think of mostly fire, right? But as many times he says, outer darkness, where there will be gnashing of teeth. That darkness we're going to see in a moment is an absolute removal of God's rule in life. That's what darkness is going to represent. But God has just filled the heavens with light. So he's populated the earth now with plants that'll keep producing and producing and producing. Now he's filled the emptiness of heaven with all of these lights. In a moment he's going to fill the earth with animals of all kinds and the skies and the water. Just with an abundance is going to be the word he's going to use several times. God is a God who fills in emptiness. Fullness of him who fills all in all, as Paul will say in the New Testament. Beautiful to see. But God is making these lights in the firmament of the heavens. And what is the purpose for these lights? Somebody want to tell me there what it says? Why do you make these lights in the firmament of the heavens? This is beyond our blue sky now. What does it say there in the text? You're not supposed to answer. But great answer. Nobody answers that unless they've studied this text. Everybody skips it. It's the first thing, besides giving the light, which is the first thing I want to look at. But I've studied this with people who are wrapped up in signs. They just want signs all the time, and they don't see that it says signs there. They go right to the next thing for seasons and days and months and years. Signs. And we'll come back to that. That's my son. I was getting on the case over there. He's been through this study a few times with me. These lights are there to divide the day from the night. Didn't God already do that? Think about that for a second. He already said he did that up in the first part. We looked at the first 5 verses. Why mention that again here? I think there's a reason. But why mention that again? God doesn't usually just sort of randomly say the same thing over again. There's a purpose. I think we'll see the purpose in a moment. But think about how it would be if there was nothing dividing day and night, if it was just light, all of a sudden darkness, and then dark, all of a sudden light. But it's not. There's this beautiful twilight that happens 2 times a day. It's gorgeous. We'll talk about that more in chapter 2. But so there's this division of day from night that God has already done. And then let it be for signs. So since that's already been brought up, we'll talk about that. What in the world are signs? Let me ask you that. How would you, if we're sitting across the table with the Bible open, I say, what's a sign? What does the word sign mean? You're not supposed to answer, but that's the right answer. So people who study their Bibles a lot know these answers, but most people that I talk to will say a sign, well, that's a miracle. I say, really? So that stop sign out there is a miracle? That green light out there that you drove through to come in, that's a miracle? No. Signs is a Bible word that started as a regular thing, like the word pastor, for example. Pastor is somebody who takes care of sheep. But as a Bible word, if I ask you what a pastor is, you're going to start telling me it's a guy who wears a suit and tie and takes care of a bunch of people at church. Well, no. Pastor takes care of sheep. The idea is carried over. Someone who takes care of God's flock. The same thing happens with the word signs. If we're talking about religious stuff and we say signs, people start thinking miracles. You know what? All the miracles are signs, but not every sign is a miracle. We need to know what a sign is first so we can understand why the miracles are signs. So a sign is something that indicates or points to something. Psalm 19, remember that? We looked at that last night. The heavens declare the glory of God. They say, somebody made me and it was God. That's a sign. The heavens are a sign. God says, I put that there for everybody. You can't escape it. The sun's going to chase you down like a bridegroom running from his chamber, and you can't run from him, and here it comes. Somebody made that sign. And all those stars that you're seeing. So these signs are meant to point to something. What are they pointing to? I think the first and biggest one is that somebody made them. There's other things, though. Sometimes God will use these as signs as he goes through the Old Testament, and the New, really. Oh, Lucifer, how you have fallen from the heavens. He's talking about a sign, this star that has fallen, this great thing that had been lifted up in the heavens has now been brought low to the earth. Don't the stars do that in their course? They go from the heavens down to the earth. God has made those stars fall. Talks about Pharaoh as a fallen star later on. Talks about this dragon dragging the stars from the heavens. The exalted ones have been brought low. Over and over. In Joel chapter 2, which is quoted in Acts chapter 2, the sun refuses to give its light and the moon will not shine in that day. Someone greater is here. It's the idea God is brighter than the sun and the moon. When he comes, they're like, what? I'm done. I'll bow to that. And the stars refuse to give their light. It's not something literal. It's a figure. Because it's pointing to someone greater who has come. And has something greater to do than even the purpose of the sun and the moon and the stars. That's an amazing thing to note as you're going through the Old Testament. I come back to this text and think about, okay, he said there are going to be signs, so what does this mean? And I look at when he uses sun and moon and stars and think about the figure that's being used there. There was even a star that was there when Jesus came, and the wise men from the east came to see the star that then disappeared. It was a sign for a time pointing to the birth of the Christ. So those were even literal and figurative signs all through the Old Testament. So God uses signs, and he's going to use these heavenly lights for signs. He used them to mark seasons and days and years, the passage of time. Does God need the passage of time? Does God need the light that these things are going to provide? Why in the world would he make these? Does God use signs himself? Not that he gives signs, he does, but does God use signs? Do the plants that are here on the earth, do they use signs? Here's why I think this is such an important text. Who uses signs? Who reads signs? Well, that's a better way to put it. Humans do. How many humans are on the earth when God makes this? 0. There are none, which shows me something about God. He's thinking of me and you and all of us as he's preparing this place ahead of time. He's a God who plans. He's a God who sets things in order with a purpose that may be still yet to come sometime way off in the future. It may be near. It's going to be another day here. But it may be way off in the future. Sometimes we don't think on God's scale. We want things on our time scale. He's a God who plans. And so I need to watch for his plan to unfold. It's beautiful getting to watch it through the Old Testament and then getting hints of what's coming still in the New Testament. We need to be watching for God's plan, not trying to force our own. He's a God who plans. And if he's planned it out, it's going to work out the way he's planned it. He does it every time. Let them be for lights. Let them divide up seasons and years and days. And all of that was so. And then we're given another interesting detail. He made the great lights to rule the day, one to rule the day and the lesser to rule the night. The idea here is governance or government. I think that's a beautiful concept. How is it that the sun governs the day? Jesus says in John 9:4, let's work while it is day. Night's coming when no one can work. We don't think about that in our society. So we have electric light. We can work anytime we want. But in an agrarian society, and certainly back in the first century, they really had to work during the day. The sun made that possible. The moon makes possible some other phases of photosynthesis and things that have to happen at night, but they're ruling in some sense. And I think even in greater sense, as I mentioned earlier that Jesus talks about hell being the outer darkness, think about the light of God, the kingdom of light, as it's called in Colossians or in 1 Peter 2, God has brought us into his marvelous light. That concept of God's rule as being light that allows us to do what we're supposed to do. Government is meant to make possible the doing of what's meant to be done. That's what the idea of government is. It's ruling over and organizing things so they can be done properly. We don't think of government that way. We think of government getting in the way. That's not what it's meant to be. God's rule and God's government makes things possible and the right things possible. And so I believe this concept of light as rulers is a sign already being given to us. And we'll see that, oh, how you've fallen, great star from the sky. The sun and the moon, the rulers refusing to give their light. You can see that dream of Joseph, that concept of the stars even bowing before him. These concepts, these signs are used all through the Old Testament. And I want to suggest to you that as we look at these first 4 chapters of Genesis, many of the symbols and signs you'll see throughout the rest of the Bible are found in these first 4 chapters. Watch where they came from. Watch where they came from, and you'll understand the signs better when you get to them. Let's pick up at verse 20, though. So actually, before that, the point I want to impress here is that God was already thinking of man. There's a purpose for man before the world is even finished, before man's even made. God is planning for us. I think that's a beautiful thing to consider. That's why I love that text so much. Well, let's look at 20 through 25. We'll finish this first lesson with these, and we'll pick up with the creation of man as we look into the second lesson a little bit later. 20 through 25. Then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the 5th day. God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. God saw that it was good. You might have heard a phrase repeated a bunch of times there. There was a law that God established, an order that God established when he made the plants. It was that they would produce according to their kind. That law is so efficient that he repeats it 7 times in the creation of all the animals. That's an efficient law. It's a law we take for granted. Think about it with plants, for example. I need to eat. I need to feed my family. I can't just go down to the Kroger and get something. I'm in this agrarian society. I've got a handful of corn. I've got a handful of wheat, and I'm going to go plant those things. But I don't know what's going to grow. I mean, it's seed, right? Something's going to come up. So I throw the corn down and the wheat down, and I get a whole bunch of weeds, and I get some pumpkin and asparagus. And no, if I plant corn, I'm going to get corn. That's a law that God established. If I plant wheat, I'm getting wheat. That's an important thing to know. That's a thing of order. That's God ordering his creation and making it possible, governing the ability for me to continue with this cycle of procreation. God is allowing me to participate in what he has created, and he's making it ordered so that I can do it well. God always does that. It's man who messes with that order. But God has given us that blessing. He does the same thing with the animals. When we read through the text here in Genesis 20 through 25, and we see that same law reiterated, repeated, established over and over 7 times, it is telling me, I don't care how many stripes that a tiger has, it's never going to give birth to a zebra. Just because they both have stripes does not mean they give birth to each other. That might seem silly to us now. But there are some taxonomical groupings where we could put a zebra and a lion and a tiger together. They both have stripes. That is a legitimate way to organize those animals. We've got to figure out as we go which ones are more closely related. And we can do that over time as we come into contact with more animals and we realize, wait, this is more closely related to a lion and then to a house cat than it is to a zebra. This is more closely related to a horse because there's other things they have in common. And maybe we get out a microscope and we can see inside them and we begin to see, oh, there's more things they have in common, and we group them even more. But we're still just sort of organizing something we've observed that God made. We didn't create those animals. We didn't create their order. We're observing and then trying to classify. That's what science does. Good science is observational. Bad science says, I made this, so it gets to be according to what I say it is. That's not right. We need not fear science. I don't think science and faith are either or propositions. Good science grows in faith toward God because look at what he has made. Johann Kepler, Newton, Einstein, these people were all looking for God in what they were seeing and observing. They realized he was the purpose behind it all, and they wanted to draw closer to him by observing what he had meant. But of course, we're ridiculed as science deniers if we try to say that evolution doesn't exist. But I want to show you something. Science, of course, has never been wrong. Don't laugh too hard. Science, of course, has never been wrong. And so when we get called science deniers, we begin to cower because these people know stuff. These are all the brainiacs that know all this stuff. We must be wrong, right? Well, God's not wrong. God's the one who said, this is how I made it. And so I need to understand based on what God has said. He's not asked me to come to him based on science, not bad science, but based on faith, what he says, what he has revealed, what he has shown, what he has manifest in me and in the rest of this world is enough evidence to see that he has made it. So up until the 1500s, everybody knew that the earth is the center of our solar system. The solar system? They probably didn't call it that at the time. They probably called it the Earth system or something similar because that was clearly the center until they began to observe a little better with a little better instrumentation and realized, wait a second, all these things are going around Helios. They're all going around the sun. It's a solar system, not an earthal system. And then they were called heretics because clearly the Bible says it all revolves around the earth. Well, the Bible doesn't say that. Anyway, but we go back and we look and we observe. And guess what? We're going to make some mistakes because there's observational biases because I can't see everything I think I can see. A man named Darwin, who wrote this great book on evolution and really wasn't confirmed of his theories, said there are some things, if they don't come to pass, then reject my theory. One of those things has been debunked because, Michael Behe expresses this for us, Darwin didn't have a microscope. He could see external things, but he couldn't really see inside what was going on, and he would never have posited some of the changes that he claimed if he could actually just see inside the cell. Darwin's black box, Michael Behe calls it. He couldn't see inside there to get the rest of the information. And so what would he have done if he were still alive? He would have said, bad observation, I need to go back and look at that again. But since he's not, people take what he had published and said, this is gospel. No, it's not. It's bad science that needs to be rejected and new stuff brought into its place. 200 years ago, people would have laughed if we had said we're descended from apes. Now it's vogue. But I believe in another 200 years, perhaps, it'll be gone again. People will say that was a ridiculous idea. Who came up with that? He won't be exalted as he is now. Science has often been wrong. Good observational science will recognize that God is creator, we're observers, and we need to recognize where our biases and where our limitations are and humbly bow before God, asking him to clarify our vision on these things. The Bible and Darwinian evolution are simply incompatible. It just doesn't happen. It's just not possible because of these laws, these blessed laws that God established that maintain order in his creation.